The name Muhammad is familiar to many. In fact, if you asked a bunch of people, I'm guessing a lot of them would be able to link Muhammad to Islam. However, I'm guessing just a few of them would be able to tell you what happened to the Islamic world after Muhammad's death. To shed some light on this topic, today's lesson will take a look at the Umayyad dynasty. However, before we get to the Umayyads, we should probably back up and explain what happened after Muhammad's death. After the death of Muhammad, his followers sought a leader for their newly founded Islamic faith. With this, they turned to Abu Bakr, Muhammad's father-in-law, who also happened to be one of his very good friends. As their new leader, they bestowed on him the title of Caliph. A Caliph is an Islamic religious ruler whose name actually means successor. The first caliphs after Muhammad were known as the rightly guided caliphs. Showing the importance of this position, a government under the rule of a caliph is known as a caliphate. Unfortunately, not all Muslims agree that Muhammad's father-in-law should have been given power. With this, unrest plagued the rule of the rightly guided caliphs. Eventually, they lost their power, and a new caliph named Muawiyah moved the capital from Medina to Damascus. This began what has come to be known as the Umayyad dynasty. Unlike the rightly guided caliphs, the caliphs of the Umayyad dynasty were more interested in politics and economics than religion. They made Arabic the official language and were the first to mint Arabic money. Along with this, they worked to improve the infrastructure of their lands. They rebuilt ancient irrigation systems, constructed stunning places of worship, and even promoted the arts. Despite their desire to grow economically, the Umayyad dynasty was plagued with warfare. First, they found themselves continually fighting the Byzantine Empire over the city of Constantinople. Going back to the issue of who should be caliph, the people of the dynasty continued the feud over who should be their rightful ruler. There were those known as the Shiites who believed that all caliphs should be descendants of Ali, Muhammad's son-in-law. On the other side of the feud were the Sunni, who asserted that all caliphs should descend from Abu Bakr, the very first caliph. After years upon years of off-and-on skirmishes, all-out war broke out between the Shiites and the Sunnis. Ironically, the Shiites, who were actually the minority, gained the upper hand in this conflict. In around the year 750 AD, a group of Shiites known as abbasids conquered the majority Umayyads, and with this their dynasty came to an end. Abu Bakr, Muhammad's father-in-law, was the first Islamic caliph after the death of Muhammad. A caliph is an Islamic religious ruler whose name actually means successor. A government under the rule of a caliph is known as a caliphate. The first caliphs after Muhammad were known as the rightly guided caliphs. Unrest encompassed the rule of the rightly guided caliphs. With this, they lost their power to Muawiyah, the founder of the Umayyad dynasty. The Umayyad caliphs were very interested in economic gain. They were the first to mint Arabic money, and they also moved their capital to Damascus. The reign of this dynasty was also marked by strife and war. On opposite sides of this conflict were the Shiites, who believed that all caliphs should be descended of Ali, Muhammad's son-in-law, and the Sunni, who asserted that all caliphs should descend from Abu Bakr, the very first caliph. Eventually, a group of Shiites known as abbasids conquered the majority Umayyads and brought an end to their rule. Although many of us are familiar with the politics of the modern Middle East, I'm guessing most of us are not nearly as versed in its history. Today we'll try to rectify this a bit as we discuss the Abbasid Empire and their rulers, known as caliphs. To begin, the Abbasid ruled the Arab world from about 750 AD to 1258 AD. They took power after conquering the former empire of the Umayyads. As we already mentioned, the rulers of the Abbasids were known as caliphs. The caliphs were descendants of Muhammad through his youngest uncle. The government of the caliphs was known as a caliphate. Caliphs considered themselves to be God's deputies. In fact, they actually called themselves shadows of God on earth. It's actually reported that anyone who entered their presence had to bow down and kiss the earth, and that a soldier stood ready to cut the head off of anyone who even slightly angered them. Being more of God figures than politicians, the Abbasid caliphs created the position of vizier. A vizier sort of stood between the caliph and the people, and for all intents and purposes ran the government. Different than many of the other rulers of the Arab Empire, the Abbasids were not interested in conquering new lands. Rather than war, they usually busied themselves with trade. With this, they moved the capital of the empire to Baghdad. Interestingly, Baghdad was constructed in the shape of a circle, with its roads dividing it like slices of pie. It was protected by brick walls and surrounded by a moat. Due to this focus on trade, the Abbasid dynasty, and especially Baghdad, became extremely wealthy. With this wealth, the Abbasid ushered in what is coined the Golden Age of Islam, a time in which science and culture flourished under the reign of the Caliphate. During this golden age of trade and prosperity, not just the caliphs and the viziers became rich. As money increased for the wealthy, it began trickling down to the common man. After all, when the rich wanted things like fine clothing and household goods, someone needed to make them. As common merchants grew wealthier from this new demand, and as their wallets got thicker, banks began cropping up to give the people a place to house their wealth. As well as banks, some other Western things also began creeping into the empire. For example, men stopped wearing the traditional Islamic robes, people started playing chess, and families started eating on tables rather than mats on the floor. Like most times, when there's wealth, there can also be trouble. As the dynasty burgeoned with wealth, it became too large for the caliphs and their viziers to govern. With this, it began to break up into smaller independent kingdoms. By around 836 AD, the ruling caliph was forced to move his capital out of Baghdad. Although the caliphate tried to regain it around the year 892 AD, they failed. Within about 50 years, their lands fell to the Persians. The Abbasids ruled the Arab world from about 750 AD to 1258 AD. Taking power from the Umayyads, the rulers of the Abbasids were known as caliphs. They were believed to be the descendants of Muhammad through his youngest uncle. The government of the caliphs were known as caliphates. The capital of the Abbasid dynasty was Baghdad. Under the caliph was the vizier. He stood between the caliph and the people. The caliphs and the viziers were very interested in growing trade. With this, they ushered in the golden age of Islam, a time in which science and culture flourished under the reign of the caliphate. As trade brought wealth to the empire, it grew larger than the caliphates could control. It soon broke into smaller, independent kingdoms before it was overtaken by the Persians around the year 945 AD.